Walid Phares, you've written this book that we're going to discuss today. Before we get into the book, I would like to start by asking you who you are. I mean, we've met at conferences and on some talk programs, but I don't know much about your background, and I would guess others don't as well. How did you come to this subject?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for being, my chat companion today on C-SPAN. Born and raised in Lebanon, as you may know, I emigrated 24 years ago this year. I was a professor of political science. I was in public politics in Lebanon. I've published books in Arabic and in French. But my American journey in academia started in 1991 as a professor at Florida Atlantic University. That's in Boca Raton, Florida. I was in charge of Middle Eastern studies. In the 90s, I published articles because we need to publish to get the tenure, and one book on the ethnic conflict of Lebanon. It was only after 9/11 that I moved to Washington. I became an analyst with MSNBC on terrorism. I've published a number of books. The most read book was Future Jihad, Terror Strategies Against America, then The War of Ideas, then The Confrontation, and then the one that preceded this book, that actually this book is volume 2 of. The title was very telling, The Coming Revolution. I published it in 2010, and I cited your own work. And that book predicted or projected that there will be rise in civil societies, and that eventually there will be a sort of a civil war or a race between the Islamists on the one hand and the seculars on the other hand. And now I've published this book titled The Lost Spring to try to analyze the evolution of this upheaval in the Middle East and projection. Let me also add that I do advise members of the US Congress and members of the European Parliament who have formed a joint caucus called the Transatlantic Parliamentary Group on Counterterrorism.
That's a very busy and distinguished professional resume. Let me try to get a little more inside your mind. What led you to leave Lebanon and to emigrate to the United States?
Actually, I did not want to leave Lebanon. I was teaching, I was in politics. I was also a publisher of a magazine called Mashreq International, which was focusing on precisely what became the Arab Spring, but that was 25, 26 years ago. Mashreq International focused on the future of minorities, persecution of minorities, ethnic, religious, but also women and democratic movements. In 1990, there was a major event, yes, that convinced me that I cannot continue with that work in Beirut. Beirut had a free area where we could publish in a very relative calm. Then the Syrian army invaded all of Lebanon, and the choice was simple. Stay in Beirut and have a shrunk freedom, or leave to the West, leave to the United States. I had many other personal reasons to come here, pursue a PhD, and I was offered a job in Florida, and that's how I became American.
But the Syrian army had entered Lebanon in 1975. So what happened in 1990 that made you feel that you really needed to leave?
In 75, 76, the Syrians controlled parts of Lebanon, not all of Lebanon. So what was known then as East Beirut or the free areas of Lebanon did not succumb to the Syrians. So I stayed there as long as there was a piece of land that was free. Many Lebanese left from day one, 15 years. I stayed throughout the 15 years of war. But definitely, having been in public speech, having opposed the Syrian opposition, having published books on the minorities and freedom and democracy, living under Syrian occupation would have not been a choice if I wanted to continue to write. So I decided, and I had a dream to get an American PhD anyway and teach here, so both facts came together.
Okay, so thanks. So now we begin by having some sense of where you are coming from, both geographically and intellectually. So you start out this book with a quite bold assertion, saying that the outcome of U.S. policies since 9/11 has been the inverse of what the policies were intended to do or proclaimed to do, that Al-Qaeda has grown, I think you say has grown immeasurably, and that we're witnessing the rise of not only Islamist but Salafist, meaning the most extreme form of Salafist forces and regimes. That's quite a powerful statement. Do you want to defend it, elaborate, explain it, elaborate?
Absolutely. This is one of the cornerstones of the book. Meaning, when we analyzed the Arab Spring, we had either a very optimistic view, these are the rebels. Many lawmakers, many leaders, many analysts said these are the rebels. The change is happening. It looks like Eastern Europe, and it is not. But then you have the pessimistic view that the entire Arab Spring is only about the Islamists and nothing could be done in the Middle East because societies are not ready. In my book, I make the case that it is neither one or the other. It's both at the same time. So you're right. From 9/11 till 2011, that decade had gigantic efforts in the region. I mean, we removed the Taliban. We removed Saddam Hussein, two totalitarian regimes. We gave space in those two spots for societies to emerge and to play the game of democracies. Many in Washington forget that the next two peaceful, nonviolent revolutions, which have failed, but they were there, were impressed by what was happening in Afghanistan. Women were in the parliament. In Iraq, it was not only the Ba'ath Party, it was many political parties. It was a mediocre democracy, but that's how democracies begin. So I make the case in this book that the Arab Spring was influenced by two precedents. One was the Syrian revolution of Lebanon. 1.5, 1.8 million people in 2005 rose against the Syrian occupation. It was not entirely successful because Hezbollah's weapons remained. And the Green Revolution in Iran in June of 2009 that also tried to rise against the Ayatollahs. Now, the Arab Spring had its own experiment. And to answer your question, the jihadists who have been removed from Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda more particularly, have recreated hubs all over the region. They're back in Iraq, in the Sunni Triangle. They are growing in Yemen, in Somalia. I don't want to even begin with what's happening in Syria, where al-Nusra and Daesh have also expanded into Lebanon. Egypt is fighting them in Sinai. So statistically speaking, just to defend at one point, yes, we may have taken out bin Laden and al-Awlaki, but this is the generation of the ancestors of Al-Qaeda. Now we're talking about the third generation.
And apart from Al-Qaeda, is it your sense at this point that the Islamists are winning in the region, even after what we've seen? I mean, certainly they were winning for a time, but then there's been pushback.
Yes.
What's pushback in Egypt and in Tunisia?
Of course.
What's your sense of the state of play now?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we are sort of in America, we are in a delayed understanding of what was happening. When we warned that the Islamists are winning, most of the answers were, no, the rebels are winning. And then now when we claim that in Egypt and Tunisia and other parts, the seculars are rising, everybody's saying, well, the Islamists are in control. So what is actually happening is a race. And in that race, the Islamists and the jihadists are consolidating wherever they can. And then they are now flanked by the seculars of Egypt. Let me say one word about Egypt. When 33 million Egyptians marched on June the 30th, this is not just the largest demonstration of Egypt in the history of demonstrations. This is because the silent majority has shifted. In the past, you had on the one edge of Muslim societies or Arab Muslim societies, a large slice of Islamists and jihadists, which would grow. On the other side, you have liberals, a thin slice, which will struggle. And then you have on the top the regime, any regime, with America or against America. What was not moving, as was the case later in Eastern Central Europe or in Latin America, is the silent majority, those millions and millions of people who would watch TV, stay, and they don't do the fight. What Egypt has done, not in the first revolution, but significantly in the second revolution, is that this silent majority moved. It shows the liberal camp, or it shows not the secular camp over the Islamists. But that is not yet the full success of democracy, because democracy needs a revolt against a dictatorship. It was done against Mubarak, a moderate dictator, and against Morsi, a radical Islamist dictator. But now the challenge in Egypt is to channel what has happened in terms of revolution, and so is the case in Tunisia, to get new political parties, because only new political parties can reorganize democracy and then allow all